slides just to kind of talk you through our plan for today before introducing our panel. Okay, this should be, you seen those slides there, okay? Perfect. So my name is Dr. Darragh McCashin. I'm a research fellow here in the Anti-Bullying Centre, and I work in the School of Psychology as well. My own background is in digital mental health and forensic psychology. I'm really excited to have recently accepted the chair of the Observatory. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague who has recently authored the Observatory report, which was recently covered in Irish media, concerning some interesting trends on the whole topic of online hate in an Irish context. We hope that might offer an interesting context to the conversation with our exciting speakers today. And as I said, it's also important for us to really open it out and learn about your questions as well. Just a bit of context for those unaware of the Observatory. It was April 2021 that it was established following the introduction of Coco's Law, and primarily working and funded by the Department of Justice and likewise Department of Education. We're really looking to, I suppose, take the pulse of what's going on in the research context here and looking at building resources to try and address these kind of really complex and sensitive issues. And as part of that is of course, engaging with yourselves by way of webinars, in addition to doing what academics do, build research, but also have an online space where we can have open access to this ever-evolving kind of knowledge base, I suppose. As I'm sure you're all aware, and certainly our panel is, if you look in Irish media recently, there has been a lot of coverage from different angles on the topic of all things online hate, online abuse, and coming at it from different demographic groups. There's been some interesting coverage, of course, particularly from female politicians just at the turn of the year, and the different dynamics implicit to online hate in that area. And there's been an increasing trend towards different forms of discrimination in the form of online hate as well. And we're seeing this across the board, and it manifesting in very different ways. So with that, we thought we would share a recent report that we conducted here in the Observatory to really get to grips with some of the trends, not all, but some of the trends with adult experiences of online hate, to really explore and maybe kind of set an agenda to think about how can we assess this problem, how can we intervene with it, and ideally prevent it happening into the future. So we don't want to bombard you with findings, but my colleague Maya Brandt-Anderson, postdoctoral researcher here in the Observatory in ABC, will talk through 5 or 6 kind of key findings before we move on to our panel. So Maya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Darragh. Right. Sorry. Here we are. So I've just shared a link to the report in the chat in case any of you would like to have a look at it. So basically just a few words about the report. In autumn of 2022, last year, we distributed a survey to 1,008 adults in Ireland, asking them about their potential negative experiences online. And this report focuses specifically on any online hate that they may have received or witnessed. So that means hateful communication that target them because of their race, ethnicity, gender, nationality, sexual orientation, religion, age, disability, appearance, or political views. And we found that almost half of the respondents, more precisely 45% of them, had experienced this at some point in their adult lives. So we also found some demographic differences. showing that some groups of people received more hate than others, and that there was a difference in the type of hate they received. So the 18 to 25-year-olds experienced more hate than older age groups, so those above the age of 35. We also found some differences in the types of hate that men and women receive, where women were significantly more likely to receive online hate targeting their gender compared to men. Now, broadly speaking, minorities experienced higher levels of online hate than majority groups. So this means that sexual minorities experienced higher levels of online hate than heterosexual people. Religious minorities experienced higher rates than the majority group, which is Roman Catholics in Ireland. So especially significant was the fact that we found that people who identify as Muslims were significantly more likely to report experiencing online hate compared to Roman Catholics. Also, people with disabilities experienced significantly more online hate compared to those who did not consider themselves as having a disability. In addition to this, we also found that minority groups received hate that specifically targeted their group characteristic, meaning that ethnic minorities often received a higher level of hate focusing on their race and ethnicity. Sexual minorities experienced higher levels of hate addressing their sexuality. Religious minorities received hate in relation to their religion, and disabled people experienced hate that focused on their disability. So when asked whether they took action in response to the hate they received, less than half of the respondents said that they had taken any kind of action. Of those who took action, they mainly spoke to family and friends, reported it to the website or social media company, or they blocked the person or account who had sent the hate. What is particularly noteworthy is that very few respondents contacted the authorities. Only 18% contacted the guards, and only 7% reported it to hotline.ie. So when comparing this to the reasons for not taking action, respondents said that they didn't feel it was serious enough, that they didn't know what to do, or that they didn't think anything would change. So in other words, respondents pointed to a lack of information about where to seek help when experiencing online hate, and a lack of belief that seeking help would actually improve the situation for them. Finally, we asked participants whether they agreed or disagreed with a number of statements in relation to how to address online hate. 79% agree or strongly agree with the statement, "I believe social media platforms should do more to stop the spread of hateful content online." And 74% agree or strongly agree with the statement, "I will support the introduction of further specific legislation to stop the spread of hateful content online." In other words, there's a large majority of the respondents who believe that more regulation and legislation is necessary, both from the social media companies and from the legislative bodies. So that's some of the key findings of the report. As mentioned, you're very welcome to kind of dig into the whole body of the report, which I've shared the link to you there in the chat. So I will hand it over to you again, Darragh.
Thanks, Maya. I think we can even use your slides perfect. I suppose when we were rounding up these interesting kind of trends, a couple of obvious but also important recommendations and talking points really strike us, I suppose. The first of which is the awareness of this issue, particularly the scope and the different types of impact that it has across different groups. I think that's where the knowledge it's evolving to. For example, some of those, for example, the age differences, that there was significantly more adverse impacts for certain age groups, depending on the type of online hate and how often it occurs and where it's occurring from. Maya also nicely outlined the nuanced help seeking that occurs and sometimes the lack of help seeking with the formal channels. So much as we see new policies and regulatory frameworks and big tech solutions, we often don't see the engagement from people who have suffered at the hands of online hate. The disproportionate impact of online hate is another issue. The first one that comes to mind was the stark figures for those with disabilities, which is an area that we haven't really looked at in depth as yet. And as we often hear with these conversations, there's always a call for engaging all the stakeholders. Young people, victims, would-be perpetrators, former perpetrators, policymakers, and big tech all at the table, co-creating solutions is the only way that we can actually truly make some progress in reducing this sort of growing trend. And that final point there is thinking about, it's perhaps more my own background, where we're thinking of who perpetrates these crimes. The tragedy of any offense is that it occurs in the first place. So how can we interrupt that motivation is another key question that we're seeking to advance here as well. And there's a lot of data that we have that we'll be continually, that we'll continue to analyze to think about, can we look at predictors of those who are victim to or potential perpetrators of online hate. So those will be the key talking points from our side, but more importantly, we're excited to introduce our panel, who I hope will be able to speak to some of these points from their own perspectives. We're delighted to welcome our three-person panel. So we have Amanda Ade, a digital content creator, activist, and podcast host. Senator Mary Seery Kearney, the Shannon spokesperson on children, disability, equality, integration and youth. And ABC's very own Dr. Debbie Ging, who's Associate Professor of Digital Media. So you're all very welcome. Before we even just get into the guts of your reactions to the report and some of the questions that we've initially scripted, perhaps you might just like to say a bit about your own background and interest in the topic. So we might start with Amanda, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Ade. I'm a digital content creator, like mentioned. I'm also the creative director of an organization called Black and Irish. At the crux of it, I think like what kind of sums up the bulk of my work is more activism. And then in relation to the other part of the question, I think prior to, actually probably around 2020, around the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, for me in particular, I think the experience of online hate is something that became very, very real. Because, you know, obviously at the time we were in lockdown, so like the majority of the work that we were doing like then moved to online. And I think it just kind of created a bit more of a platform, I think, for people that disagreed with, you know, certain elements of the work that we were doing or our messaging, to just show that hate. So that I think it's obviously, so it's something that I'd known about before, but I think what didn't really become as personal until around that time.
Thank you, Amanda, and you're very welcome here today. I'll pass it over to Senator Kearney. A bit of your background.
So hi, my name is Mary Seery Kearney, and I prior to coming into politics, I worked as a barrister in employment law and privacy law, and had a presence online. Nothing of any great significance. Never encountered anything negative or nasty. It was all very positive, all lovely likes. I used social media for contact with my family throughout the world. We shared pictures. You know, we did that sort of thing. Then I decided I was running for the local elections in 2019 and put up my first post of me under, you know, I launched it with doing a public meeting on cyber safety, actually. And put up the photograph and of us all ready to do our leaflets under the poster. And all of a sudden there was a deluge of abuse, of personal messages to me. And I found it very frightening. I was shocked. It made me think twice of, is this really where I want to go and what I want to do? And then you sort of thought, well, look, who am I? I'm no different to any other woman in politics, and this goes with what happens. I moderated it to try and hide it from my family, particularly my husband, frightened that if he saw it, you know, he'd be like, oh no, we couldn't possibly go down this route. Not that he would, but you know, I was afraid for him and his fears. So I suppose that as I went from local politics in the local authority to national politics, it amplifies the attraction of people who have just really I suppose malafidés who are acting. There are bad actors with deliberate agendas, and they start contacting you. So I'm now at a place where someone in my office posts to social media. You have to be on social media. In politics, you can't not be. But I very, very rarely go on and have a look, particularly on, there are some platforms that I would have used and stayed in contact with family before. I haven't even seen their posts in months because you just couldn't go there. It's too toxic. So that's where I'm at coming into it.
Very helpful context. Thank you for that, Mary. And I'll pass it to Debbie to offer her own background.
Thanks, Darragh. So I'm an associate professor in the School of Communications in DCU, and my research focuses on online misogyny and gender hate online, as well as on some of the sources of a lot of this hate in terms of the political sources. So I also research the manosphere, male supremacist formations online, incels in particular, but all aspects of the manosphere as well. And in addition to that, I also look at youth cultures and gender-based and sexual abuse online among young people, and interventions in particular that can be used to improve that situation. So there's kind of 3 areas of research that I focus on.
Great. Well, thank you all for your own individual kind of context. It's a fascinating mix as well, and I hope it will really inform the conversation. I suppose even before we get into the scripted questions, the 3 of your reactions to some of those trends presented, what's kind of the first sort of response when you see numbers like that and different sort of group trends?
Which doesn't surprise me, I would have to say. It seems that the figures are broadly in line with international reports and statistics on this topic, from what I can see across the board. I mean, your report, you're not getting down into so much the details of the types of hate sometimes. So, you know, is it image-based sexual abuse? And then the statistics start getting much more unbalanced in terms of, you know, what's called revenge porn sometimes, because 90% of victims of revenge porn are women, according to a recent American study. But yeah, I mean, none of it really surprises me, unfortunately.
I think that fact that it doesn't surprise us leads to a very disturbing, almost acquiescence that our public discourse is so low, so bad, so vulgar, so confrontational. We wouldn't accept that in our face-to-face engagements with people. And I remember one of the first books I read on this was Dr. Mary Aiken's The Cyber Effect, of the fact that people are more vulnerable, they're more open, they're more aggressive, they're more everything in an online field than they are in person. And while we all agree with that, we don't actually interrogate what are the structures and architecture that needs to go into society to challenge that our culture is changing. And it is being changed for us by actors on social media who are monetizing this for their own benefit. So things like that. Anyway, sorry, that's my platform. I could rant for the next half hour, but I won't. Over to you, Amanda.
No, very, very much the same. Genuinely not surprised at all, and I'm actually glad that you mentioned the word culture. The last kind of video I did on anti-bullying was kind of addressing. At the time, it was more locker room culture. Just in relation to like some of the things that have come out online about, particularly like rugby teams and that kind of thing. But yeah, like it goes back to like I think what kind of motivates a lot of our work at Black and Irish is changing that culture and changing perceptions of just certain groups of people that may be outside one's like little bubble. And I think just at the core of it, I think it's creating awareness and trying to actually challenge that from like a cultural perspective is what then will overflow into people's the type of ways that people engage then online.
Thanks for that. And I mean, you've all kind of given a very interesting kind of starting point, but whether it's using social media for activism, for example, the BLM movement during COVID, as Amanda mentioned, and the hate that comes in response to that, whether it's getting into politics, Mary, and talking about rarely being able to engage with social media for fear of what you or indeed your husband would see. These real kind of lived experiences day by day that have a impact your behaviors. I'm just for people that might not be on this panel, but you may have seen their experiences. Have you witnessed any other types of online hate that maybe you'd like to share with us, or any personal experiences that really kind of bring this issue to the fore? Does anything spring to mind? I know there's been many high-profile cases in Ireland, but is there anything that you'd like to highlight?
I think if I may, the
Please.
potential now that we move from what was purely online to real life threat, I think that's the fear now. And the lived reality in many instances. In recent times, I had an individual target me online. Then WhatsApp messages started coming in from this individual. They came into my constituency phone. Then they started coming to my private phone. So you block and you report and you do whatever. But then it went to letters being handed into Leinster House. And at that point, then I thought, well, the next stage is to show up outside my home, and when you're running for politics, your personal address is out in the public domain. Now, mind you, it would have been obvious from the big truck with my picture on the side of it in the front driveway, but on a main road. But that's the next thing. And the next thing is my parents live with me, my husband, I have a young daughter. If they come out, what happens? Do they start engaging confrontation? Do we end up in assault? Where does that go to? Now, in the beginning, when I got threats of rape and all sorts of things in the very beginning, it never occurred to me to contact the Gardaí or to do anything like that. Then when I went public about it on foot of an Irish Times poll, the Gardaí in Terranure rang me to say, for God's sake, why didn't you come down to us and talk this over? And I was like, you have more important things to be doing than doing that with me. And they were like, never do that again. So I suppose it's finding that threshold of, at what point do you report it to the Gardaí? Well, the minute that somebody made an effort to physically come into my life, then at that point, that I have decided that's my cutoff, and the Gardaí are now involved in that situation. And there hasn't been anything in the last couple of months. But you have that, and we've seen high-profile prosecutions. Jennifer Carroll McNeil making a complaint where that's the intrusion and threat and fear of this person arriving into your life is really terrible and very real.
Thank you for sharing that. And it's such a challenging ordeal that many people can't relate to, but many people can as well. And how we actually respond to that, we might actually come back to the response strategies a little bit later. But for the moment, even just capturing those different types of experiences is really important. So yeah, that transfer of online hate and abuse into real life threat, it's absolutely one area that requires its own sort of response strategies. Amanda or Debbie, any other particular types of online hate that you would care to share?
Yeah, pretty much the same. I think at the height of the BLM movement at the time, you know, I was quite vocal online. So initially, it was a lot of death threats, messages, constant like barricades of messages, fake pages being created, deliberate misinformation being spread then about me on certain online platforms. And then like Senator Mary mentioned there, like when it goes from then just online, because you know I think there's a certain element of Irish culture that's like, I'll be grand, or as long as you know like they're not actually like hurting you or doing anything to you physically, then it's not that much of an issue. Like it's very much a sweep it under the rug kind of thing. And also then trying to find the line then also, again, another very much Irish thing, but like everything is, it's just having a crack, or it's just, you can't take a joke, or it's just what that kind of vibe, even from people that I would have considered, you know, like people that I would actually know personally, like would say certain things or whatever that would seem quite kind of threatening. Well, would just kind of be brushed across as like, oh, we're just messing with you. But then like, again, like it's like at what point then does that actually become an issue, or at what point is that something to actually report? And yeah, for me as well, it became very much real when, you know, I'm seeing certain things being like spray painted on our home, on my house. So I lived with my parents at the time, on our family home, like the N-word just spray painted across the front door. Even like on the housing, on the front of the estate, then very much the same, just like a barricade of like messages and stuff just being painted across the walls. And now looking, my neighbors are fantastic at the time, like they would come out and paint over it and stuff like that and kind of help out. And at that time it was reported. Similar things like you mentioned, it happened to Emer O'Neill as well. I know we were speaking about it recently. So similar things to her, and about her, I think they didn't know which house she lived in and ended up burning her neighbor's car. And I think the aim was actually to get to her car, and stuff like that, and her house being spray painted and egged and stuff being thrown. So again, it's like when it comes into your everyday life, when it comes into your reality, then you realize that, you know, this is not just an invisible troll online. This is actually someone with an intention to do harm. And I think that it needs to be taken seriously from the onset. So from the moment that a threat is made, I think there needs to be a certain seriousness about it, and there needs to be certain repercussions to, I think, even inhibit other people from engaging. Because I think when people see that certain people are getting away with it, then it makes it a lot easier to just kind of join in.
Thank you, Amanda. And again, it's really powerful to hear these examples. So thank you for sharing. You very nicely describe kind of that very Irish thing of the crack, the so-called banter, the messing culture on the one hand, the noise of all of that online. And when that becomes, as you said, at what point does that then become something that's worthy of complaint or intervention? And then on the other hand, like the Senator's example, that real life threat, not even threat, actual actions and crimes in person. So thank you for sharing that. Debbie, did you want to add any particular examples that you would like to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, I've been observing this since Gamergate in 2014. You know, kind of up close and personal, no, but online, and I've seen how it's affected people for a long time who have been doxxed and threatened and had to move house. People like Anita Sarkeesian and various targets of Gamergate. And in many ways, that was a turning point in this kind of discourse. And so it's been, I don't want to use the word interesting, it's not the right word, but it has been interesting, I suppose, to watch, you know, the steady creep of this growing and becoming a reality in Ireland with, you know, with people like Hazel Chu being attacked, Tara Flynn, because of her involvement in the repeal campaign, who's written about this, you know, who ended up going off Twitter, offline completely, and seeing that become a reality in Ireland, you know, since 2014. And it's kind of had to become a reality before people would actually take it seriously, because before that it was like, oh, this is an American phenomenon, or this is just a very niche you know, part of gamer culture online. It's not really, but it's mainstream now. So yeah, I mean, I've witnessed and read about really extreme cases of online hate, and I think people tend to think mostly in terms of verbal abuse because it's the most common form, but there are a lot of forms of tech facilitated hate and abuse, you know, including doxing, hacking people's websites, non-consensual sharing of private images, cyberstalking, coordinated swarm attacks. A lot of it's very strategic, a lot of it's, I don't like to use the word creative, but it can be quite creative. And so we have to look again at, you know, is it interpersonal? Is it political? What's the strategy? What's the motive? Because there's lots of different types of hate and lots of different types of attacks. So as an academic, for example, very often the strategy is to undermine your credentials. It's to discredit your research, and to, you know, to make fun of your work, or to insinuate that your work is a waste of taxpayers' money. Things that will kind of make you feel really exposed and concerned, I guess. It's a lot of psychological tactics at work. But, you know, I kind of managed personally to dodge a lot of it. You have to play a very careful game on social media and keep your head below the parapet, which is something that obviously others can't afford to do. But at the same time, we have to promote our work on social media. So you're just hoping that you can keep kind of diving and ducking and coming up and going down again, because it's like a swarm. You can attract comments here and there. I discovered I was on Graham Linehan's Substack recently, where he's calling me an extremist and saying my research should be thrown in the bin and I'm a pronoun person, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, whatever. But you know, what you don't want is the swarm coming after you. And it is like a swarm. If one or two is fine, but if the swarm comes after you, then you know, that's it. You've got to either go off Twitter, or you've got to, you know, that's serious. So it's just a matter of time, or it's a matter of trying to evade it, I guess. I mean, there's 79 comments or something underneath his Substack. I didn't read them. But yeah, now, have I received death threats or the type of stuff that Mary and Amanda are talking about directly to me? No.
Thank you all for those interesting examples. I mean, we're approaching the question now as we sit here on International Women's Day. This question of how or why women are experiencing more of specific types of online hate. I mean, in our report, the women were disproportionately more likely to be targeted because of their gender, whereas men perhaps more likely to be targeted for age and nationality. So would anyone like to maybe speak to why these gendered patterns of online hate are growing and evolving in the ways that they are?
Well, patriarchy.
Okay.
Next question.
Yeah, Debbie has answered for us all there. Can I just comment on one thing though? I mean, your answer was brilliant. I've taken notes and I need to look up some of the words you've used, Debbie. But you ended it by saying, you know, I haven't got death threats, but that's in a way, what happens affects how we behave.
Oh yeah.
You know, and whether it's it is certainly a headline framing to say, yeah, I've had death and rape threats, but actually it's the discrediting of you. You know, throughout the surrogacy campaign, there was relations of a particular well-known family in the courts at the moment, claiming that I was paid by clinics, paid by, you know, you get all of that. That is in some ways more hurtful, because for me, they haven't shown up with graffiti in the horrific way they have for Amanda and Freeman O'Neill, but in a way that's, you think, gosh, it goes to the very heart of who you are, your integrity of all of those. So that's really, really hard. But from in answer to your question, Darragh, yeah, it is the patriarchy. You know, there's a campaign group that regularly email in to all of the Oireachtas members. So, you're one of 220 emails that came in, who will challenge why we don't have a cross-party Oireachtas group on violence against these particular men. And I always reply saying, I always speak up when I'm speaking about domestic violence. I always mention the fact that there are male victims and whatever. Now I've stopped replying to this, but then they go on to a whole list of why it's terrible and why I'm, this, that, and the other, and why women are, are aggressive against men, and not in the domestic violence, but actually how we are part of a conspiracy to sideline them, to without any sense of awareness that any rational human being reading the email is going to go, are you for real? So that kind of, that's quite fascinating. And it goes to me then to a sense of entitlement to attack and to say, how dare you raise your head above the parapet?
And you probably find that these people aren't out campaigning tirelessly for male domestic victims of abuse. That's not really what their agenda is at all, is it? Yeah.
That's exactly it.
There's a great, there's a great way of, I suppose, cutting through this both sidesism kind of stuff. Somebody asked Clementine Ford, the Australian journalist and feminist, the other day, how come women hate men so much? And her response, I won't quote any of it here because it's not suitable probably for this forum exactly, but do go and have a look on her Instagram, because her response is, it's really spot on. In terms of, yes, but you don't fear being raped every time you go into a dark street, and it's not about whether it's all men or not, it's about the culture in which we live. So, we have to keep coming back to power, and we have to keep coming back to structural analysis of hate, whether it's racist or misogynist, and we have to keep coming back to the patriarchy, therefore.
I might even just jump to one of the questions that we had actually scripted for you, Debbie, just on that particular topic. And those really interesting examples of kind of, these so-called culture wars and this kind of debate that is masquerading actually just gender-based abuse or gender-based online hate, where it's not about the issue of not all men or the debate about domestic violence. It's just simply some intellectualized front to simply just verbally abuse you. You've done some fascinating work on mapping the manosphere, and there's been some interesting coverage of your research in that area. Could you maybe even summarize some of those communities for us, and maybe help us understand why there is such high prevalence of online hate against women?
Yeah, obviously, misogyny precedes the internet, as we know, and as long as we have patriarchy, we have misogyny. So, men's groups and anti-feminism and male supremacism in various forms has been around forever. But we have seen since the beginning of the digital era, digital culture, I suppose, is a disproportionately amplified that their views have been disproportionately amplified and more recently mainstreamed as well. So yeah, it's a backlash against perceived progresses, but it's also part of the wider culture wars. So I think all of this, not all of this, not all misogyny is political, but a lot of it is, I think. And certainly, Mary, the stuff that you're alluding to, and Amanda, the stuff that you're alluding to, it is political. These attacks are connected to the rise of the far right. They're connected to anti-progressive agendas, which are anti-feminist, anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ agendas. And I think in that regard, the manosphere is very powerful, overlaps with the alt-right and the far right and across many different kind of pressure points. And now we're seeing it increasingly mainstream. So we're seeing these ideas like the red pill. We're seeing a lot of manosphere, male supremacist ideology, you know, leaking out into the mainstream. So I think that is particularly worrying on platforms like YouTube and TikTok. And we're looking at the moment at how recommender functions are amplifying that content as well on both of those platforms. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. It does. It's a nice summary mapping. And maybe a quick follow-up question. Would those sorts of communities be responsible for a very large proportion of that online hate? Or is it more complex than that?
I think it's more complex than that. Yes, certainly the politicized attacks. But, you know, there's different facets to those communities. There's more mainstream men's rights activists, and then you have pickup artists, and then you have incels. You know, and incels, for example, would mostly communicate with one another. They're not outward facing. So what they say is very misogynist very often, but it's not to women. It's the more mainstream aspects of the manosphere who interact with women, I think, that are probably more, you know, have more impact. But alongside that, then you have a lot of the hate that women experience is of an interpersonal nature. It's to do with relationships, it's to do with, you know, revenge porn and cyberstalking and sexual abuse. So it's really complicated. Of course, there's the continuum, you know, between those things, because sometimes the sexual abuse or the image sharing or the revenge porn is used as a kind of warning, not just to that woman, but to all women. I mean, all of these acts serve as warnings to all women and have that kind of chilling effect. So I think we need to see misogyny. Misogyny is sometimes a sentiment, for sure, but I think very often and increasingly it's a strategy.
Thank you, Debbie. And even just as you're outlining that quite nicely, Debbie, it's a very helpful summary for that particular world that is the manosphere. And I'm just wondering, Amanda, are there any parallels with the issue of race-based abuse, or is it? And of course, it's complex in its own right. But is there any kind of parallels that you might draw from hearing Debbie's summary?
Yeah, essentially it's the same thing. Like the reason that it exists online is because it first exists in, you know, within society, and that's what's brought online. And I think Debbie touched on a very good points there. You know, with the recommender content, I think it makes it easier for people then to find communities of like-minded individuals, and even for people that may have just even inklings of those kind of thoughts or whatever, to find communities where those thoughts then are fed and amplified even more so. So I think that again goes in line with any form of hate, whether it's race-based, whether it's you know, specific to gender or sexual orientation or whatever. And I think when people are able to find communities, it creates this sort of echo chamber and, you know, multiplies whatever implicit biases they may already have. And again, I think once they find their communities online, then it becomes a lot easier to hide behind a keyboard as opposed to actually, you know, like saying it to someone's face. Like a lot of people wouldn't, a lot of the stuff that people put out online, they wouldn't feel comfortable to say, you know, in person. So, you know, there's so many nuances and so many things that kind of make it more complex. The fact that it's online, the fact that there's communities of people that may not even be in their regions, people across the world, you know, they're still able to find that community and find and not feel so alone in that train of thought. And I think it justifies that then in people's minds, and makes it easier then to act on whatever that may be.
And that's a really interesting distinction as well. So on the one hand, we do have the online world reflecting offline biases. And then we have the online world that makes things worse, makes people do or say things they may not ordinarily do. In the world of psychology, you know, that kind of the AAA, the affordability, the anonymity, and the accessibility of the online space really does propagate people to do things they wouldn't normally do. And you've both shared examples of how that then clusters into different communities that then target, whether it's certain genders or race-based abuse as well. We have about kind of 25 minutes left for our own kind of panel discussion before we open the floor to questions, but maybe turning more towards response strategies. So you've given some really intriguing examples, and we've talked about how it's impacted your own lives in different ways. A very broad question. In Ireland specifically, where should we even start with addressing this issue of trying to tackle online hate? What springs to mind to our panel?
Don't mind jumping in quickly there. I think it should be like a multi-pronged approach, because I think the issue is a lot more complex than what it kind of appears to be on the surface. On one end of things, I think there needs to be like preventative, there needs to be preventative measures put in place, whether that be, you know, awareness raising, getting into schools early, because particularly, you know, what I've even noticed in the last couple of weeks, TikTok culture and Discord culture amongst young people is becoming very, very toxic. And there's certain forums on Discords that are popular, particularly with like teenage boys. And it's, you know, the same kind of red pill ideas, the Andrew Tates and that kind of thing, you know, feeding impressionable young teenagers with these ideologies that I think that will then carry into how they actually perceive women and interact with women as a whole. So preventative measures, I think, need to be done like in schools from a very, very early onset, just to kind of counteract whatever ideas they may be being fed online, and creating space for, you know, those conversations to be had and making it not so like taboo, particularly in a school kind of setting. And then on the other end of thing, I think there needs to be repercussions. So whether that be bringing things into legislation, whether that be platforms being a bit more stern, and when they recognize certain patterns or certain content being recommended to people, either taking it down or deactivating accounts, suspending accounts. I know there's like a lot has been done more in the last couple of months, because I know that you can now block not just an account, but any account that may be created by that same individual. So I do see some steps being made, and even just recognizing certain hate speech, and, you know, the comments either being removed or a warning box pops up now, I think, for certain comments, and they ask, are you sure you want to post this? So I think it needs to not be so much of a question. I think when certain things are, when certain words or keywords are mentioned, just it automatically just like either suspending the account, banning the account, whatever, and not leaving any kind of room for that to grow or even to get out there in the first place. So preventative, and then some kind of repercussions, whether that be from the, you know, from the platforms or from a legal aspect, you know, actively including it in our legislation against hate speech.
Thank you, Amanda. That's really helpful. I just briefly add on to that, actually, maybe a finding from the report that was of interest. Much as the respondents, who are all adults, 18 plus, were largely progressive in their attitudes. We need more legislative and regulatory protections, and we support more policies and so forth. But the 18 to 25 group were disproportionately more likely to disagree with that, which is an intriguing finding, which we're going to investigate further. Just an interesting kind of talking point as well, in the context of thinking about what can everyone get on board with by way of policies. And like, if we simply push the online hate to a different platform, how do we manage those dynamics? So that was particularly interesting. Debbie or Mary, any other things spring to mind, and where we should start with addressing this issue?
I think that we've seen the legislation now for the Online Safety Commission. We've yet to see how that will operate in fact. But that, and I suppose in strengthening hate speech, broadening the protected categories, all of that, I think it will certainly strengthen and have a response from the legislature. However, on some of it, there's a horses bolted piece to it that bothers me and has bothered me for years. You know, we have, if we go back decades to who held information, well, it was universities or government, and then you had papers on record, you had newspapers, you're just all seeing the same thing at the same time. You know, we read the same papers, we interacted on those kind of levels. There was the chats like that. While on one hand, the connectivity of social media has been fantastic, and the freedom of speech of has been fantastic. We have found ourselves in a place where global organizations that are profiting are now in control, and they're bigger than governments, they're bigger than states. We have to have a cross EU response at the very least, but we almost need a even at a greater level than that. And I don't know how we get back that control in order to be mindful of our culture has completely changed, and we're only catching up with it, and legislators are only ever going to be running after that. So I mean, I would be in the camp where, you know, the idea that Meta get to set their own community rules is ridiculous. Society and people who are elected by the people should set community rules, because there's a good, and the implementation of those, there's no consequences if they don't. They have never responded to anything I've ever complained about, you know, never. It's up to me to block. I have a certain protection because I was part of that repeal shield during the Repeal the 8th campaign. And so a lot of things I don't see, and they don't see me as a consequence. But you know, it sort of feels like, gosh, how do we need this at a multinational and international level, and we need to make platforms responsible for what they publish, because they could, when there was a threat of music rights, and you know, they were able to respond then. So I don't buy it that they can't respond now, that it's too big and that it can't be done. But I'm capturing exactly how. So that's why I went before you, Debbie, because you'll have all the answers.
I wish, but I agree.
Tell me, and I'll talk.
I agree with you 100%, and I think, you know, what both of you say, Amanda, as well, is that the key to this is education, but there has to be a paradigm shift in education away from cyber safety and this kind of reactive approach to an education that is about digital citizenship. It's about digital rights, it's about digital ethics, because you have to shift the paradigm. At the moment, we have a very reactive approach to cyber safety, which is block, delete, report. And of course we have to do that because we have to survive. It's a, you know, pragmatic response on a daily basis, but it doesn't ask the right questions. It doesn't ask any questions. We need an education paradigm that asks questions such as, you know, the ones Mary has asked, which is, why do a small handful of billionaires own most of the social media on which we operate? Why would anyone consider this privately owned space to be an adequate public sphere? Why can't we have not-for-profit social media? How do we build a digital democracy? And what are our rights as digital citizens? And these are the things that young people from a very young age need to be asking. It has to be, you know, I wish we taught philosophy as mandatory in Irish schools, because we kind of need a digital philosophy or at least digital ethics approach to this question. And it has to start from a very young age, because then you build critical digital media literacy from a young age. And no matter how savvy, tech savvy or digitally literate people are, they're not necessarily critically digital literate. And that's what we have to build, I think.
So all very straightforward and easy to implement. I mean, it is so complex, isn't it? And I'm conscious of such a broad question, but you've all given some really interesting insights. And of course, I mean, I'm just taking notes here. I mean, particularly in Ireland, the big tech power that is there, and it being larger than the economy says a lot about how all these push-pull factors that you've all outlined, they really speak to this more medium to long-term strategy, which then of course feeds into, it's very interesting that we often go back to, okay, we need to educate first. And Debbie made the point about asking the right questions first. And sometimes I wonder, do we even know what the right questions are? We know that we want to work towards philosophically informed, digital ethics and citizenship, what might that look like? And, you know, this critical concept of, okay, the online space is not just a public square where you can say what you want without consequence, and starting those conversations early. I'm just wondering, you know, we've focused a lot on certainly some of the negatives, but in that kind of more constructive space, are there any examples of initiatives, however large, small, where there has been good progress made in tackling online hate? Any kind of positive examples of initiatives that could inspire us going forward?
Maybe the answer is in the fact that none of us rush to answer. Because maybe that is, you know, I mean, I like I think Debbie's point of we're reactive. You know, we're all getting training now in our personal safety, training in how to, you know, don't feed the trolls, and that's been going on for the last couple of years. But now it has moved into personal, physical safety. You know, the idea that a politician in our country would get an email saying, wear comfortable shoes so that you can retreat quickly. You know, things like that is really quite frightening. So I don't know. I mean, there is the empowerment of communities. There is a discussion of it. I think a lot of people in the public space were afraid to speak about it because you may be perceived to be weak. You may be, you know, it may do a vulnerability. I push back on that on the basis of, no, we have to challenge that our public discourse is being vulgarized and weaponized. We need to say that that's not okay. It's not okay that Amanda would be so horrifically attacked and undermined in what is a very legitimate and strong voice. Why do interviews? So it's not unique to politics is my main thing. But we need to challenge back on that, you know.
Exactly, and the point you made as well, you know, as long as it's profitable, as long as conflict and hate are profitable, we're not going to resolve this. So the problem becomes a greater one of the distribution of wealth. It's, you know, as long as we're just trying to push back against individual instances of hate, we're just dealing with the symptoms. You want to deal with the causes, then we do have to talk very seriously about the distribution of wealth in the world, and that becomes a different, political project. Do we want to start talking about revolution on International Women's Day? Yeah, hell yeah. But you know, what does that look like? Would you pull the plug on the internet as it is now, in terms of its ownership and political structure? Probably. I think we need to rebuild it, but this is revolutionary talk, and I'm completely aware of how kind of out of place that is in the current conjuncture, which is also a problem, I guess, you know. But it does demand structural analysis. We can't keep trying to patch up bits of it. We have to look at the structural causes of racism, the structural causes of misogyny, and you know, our structural analysis also has to be intersectional. We can't ignore class. We can't ignore the distribution of wealth. And this is a major problem with the social media companies. The distribution of wealth is obscene. We've never seen anything like it before. I don't think people have time to think about that much, unfortunately.
Don't unplug just yet, Debbie, because we need you for another half hour.
I'll try not to. Sorry about that little outburst.
No, it's absolutely
following
welcome.
you in the revolution.
Pretty much. But,
the revolution starts here. I mean, I one thought that sprung to mind just in trying to balance the kind of however limited positive trends there are amidst a very negative set of trends. I just wanted to ask Amanda, some of the activism that you've leveraged through social media, particularly during COVID, as you outlined, and if you've just seen the enthusiasm of the young people at a recent event that we were at, seeing how they were responding to you and hanging on your every word, it's just amazing to witness in person. How do you, in your own head, balance okay, social media has been such a helpful tool for you and your career and your world, but on the other hand, all the issues we're discussing today are almost seem insurmountable. How do you balance those two?
It's tough. It's tough because, like you mentioned, like I know a lot of, like in the same way I've kind of been able to create a community online to spread, positive messaging. And there's, on the other hand, people are able to do that for completely different reasons. It's tough. It's honestly, it's very tough. Like but at the same time, it doesn't take away from the fact that like I'm aware that on a large scale of things, like Debbie like perfectly put, on a large scale of things, this is part of a bigger problem. And in any kind of world problem, in any kind of big problem, there will be some benefits to it. So there are some things that you can get out of certain things, but at the same time, realizing that overall, what does this mean for us as a whole going forward? And at the moment, the trend seems to be, as much as there are positive things being done, the trend is that there are also like negative things being done on a large scale, and that's growing. Bringing that then into real life, that's scary. And even though there are also positives, I think recognizing that the potential of the negatives, I think far outweighs that. So I think like on a thinking long term, then like that needs to be tackled then before we can get to a space where we can fully be okay with the positives of it, or fully be able to use it for that particular reason. And I think like Debbie put, like dismantling it as a whole, bringing it all down, and then going back to like our ethics, bringing it back to our culture, as a society. What do we want? What kind of behavior is tolerated, and what kind of things are promoted? Asking those questions and bringing it back to the ethics of things, I think needs to be done. And before, like it's bittersweet because you can't fully enjoy the positives of it, like due to the negatives. So all of that needs to be, we need to kind of take out the trash first before we're able to sit down and have dinner. For lack of a better analogy.
A nice phrase. I like it. I might even pass to my colleague Maya, who's been listening intently to the panel. Maya, I mean, when we were working through this data in the report and looking at these trends and formulating the questions for the panel here, it's just really interesting to hear the particular insights and examples that have come forward. Do you want to offer any reflection? What are you taking away from the panel discussion so far?
I mean, I'm following Debbie into the revolution, that's for sure. But I think I feel like it always comes, whenever we talk about how do we address these issues, I just feel like the panel has already kind of highlighted this so brilliantly in terms of always trying to understand the structures in place that make the hate possible in the first place. So it's not, and kind of understanding that this is not just something that exists online and something that might only feel real if the threats are offline, like understanding how the online and offline is no longer two separate things. We live online as well as we live offline. We can't kind of separate the two. So a threat being made online or hate expressed online is not just something that we feel in our online world, and then we sort of put our phone away and then everything's fine. It sort of lingers, it stays with us, and I think that's really important to kind of to remember. And also, I suppose the kind of fact that it comes that what we'd like to see in terms of how to address this, as the panelists have highlighted already, is that it comes down to education. It comes down to starting really early and addressing both boys and girls in schools, talking about how to be online, but also just talking about how to be around each other. But yeah, I mean, all the panelists have already said all these things much better than I can. So I think that I'll leave it at that.
Put you on the spot. Thanks, Maya. It's always useful just to hear a reflection as well. And I mean, before I get onto the last question, which the panel might want to chew on, which is the advice that you would give, whether it's personal, professional, or kind of more structural, advice to people who have or are experiencing online hate in this moment, what advice you might give them. Before we address that question, Is there any other topic or question that I haven't asked that you feel would be important? Okay, we'll take that as satisfactory for now.
I feel like, sorry, Darragh, to interrupt. I feel
Go
like
ahead, Debbie.
Mary mentioned it. Obviously, we haven't talked a lot about the new legislation, and I do think that is very promising. Yeah, it remains to be seen, you know, how these new acts will pan out. And it's great that there's an online safety commissioner in place. So I suppose just want to record that, you know, that these are really positive developments and that there has to be robust legislation to deal with this. But then the incidents are just so many and so multiple. I mean, look at all the stuff that we've been seeing recently, all the videos that have been posted in these racist far right demonstrations and stuff like that. I mean, how do you report these? How does that get dealt with? I don't know.
Yeah,
there's hundreds of them.
And how that legislation is actually operationalized to give real have real effects for people that are experiencing such abuse. And likewise, so I think the early education and gender-specific education, digital citizenship have all been linked to these present-day challenges. And indeed, some of the work within ABC now and into the future, indeed, including Debbie and Maya, will be looking at what's actually happening with, for example, when young boys go online, how do they get, how do they get exposed and to more and more extreme content, and what are the effects of that? How can we intervene? How can we test if these interventions work? This is all part of the mission of the Observatory going forward. So just to address that last question, advice to those that might be currently experiencing online hate. You've all shared very personal examples. If someone was to come to you and ask for advice based on your experiences, what are the types of things that you might say?
I'll go. I suppose as individuals, and I mean, today's International Women's Day. A lot of what we do today is to encourage people into public life to speak up, to speak out for their passions, and to get involved in politics. We aspire to have a 50-50 representation, ideally a 60-40 in the right way around in the years to come. So in order to do that, I'm involved in a group that is trying to foster young people that are involved in politics or interested in politics and looking at maybe running in the local elections next year. And one of the module, the particular module that I'm taking and giving on it, is going to be around fierce self-compassion, looking at that yourself being comfortable in your own skin, being able to, because first of all, you've got to be able to argue. Politics is about being able to argue with people up close and personal in the flesh, which can be a little bit abrasive. I mean, I was a barrister coming into it, so you were kind of used to that, and then going for coffee afterwards. So it can be quite robust and it can be quite personal. But so we're looking at ensuring that there are resources in the person to be compassionate about yourself, not striving for perfection, striving for good enough, and that it means you're going to make mistakes. How do you forgive yourself for making mistakes? How do you stick by your point, and how do you articulate your own point and hold with that? Be passionate about what you're passionate about, be able to take the criticism and be able to stave off the criticism. So I think that we need to be doing that in schools. If somebody was coming to me now talking about that, that's where I'd start with building up that person, trying to almost disassociate from the characterization of them online, putting in systems. I have systems myself. I have the luxury that I have a fantastic friend who works with me and shields me from a lot of that. But to just be careful about it. The first time I saw criticism of myself online, I literally got sick and my knees went from under me. Now I'm a little bit harder, a little bit tougher, a little bit, you nearly think, God, I'm irrelevant if I'm not giving out about if somebody doesn't give out about me. But at the same time, managing it and being okay in my own skin, because quite often it is the worries of when people do take their own lives, when we have had things like that happen. How do we ensure that there is sufficient resilience in the self to be able to cope with it, and detecting where it does get too much, that we protect people and we have some sort of system of coming in and around, and that everybody needs a system around them to say, it's okay. If I break my leg, it's obvious, but if I'm stressed out from what's happening on social media, how do you know when you've hit a point where it's no longer tolerable and you can't cope with it? And how do you trigger a safety mechanism around that?
Thank you very much. Very helpful. That spectrum of self-compassion and how we can apply it. Very interesting. Debbie and Amanda, what advice might you?
I don't know, for me, I think one of the most important things, actually, before I get to that one, the first one, I think reports. Don't be afraid to report things. I think it leaves a good paper trail. Just in case anything ever needs to go to a different kind of, you need a higher approach to things. I think having that paper trail of either reports or either reporting that online or even to authorities for certain things, I think it's good to have. And then on the other end of that, then I think just knowing when to actually just switch off the computer or switch off your phone and disconnect from it entirely. I think for me was like a major turning point in actually just like preserving my mental health. Particularly around that time, I think, because a lot of the work was online, so I'm constantly online and constantly seeing these the negative feedback and the hate and that kind of thing. So when it's constantly in your face, it seems a lot bigger than it actually is. And then when you disconnect, you realize, okay, that's actually, it's over there. And you're able to just live life a bit more then, and not attach too much importance to it in that specific moment. So yeah, taking social media breaks and either, disconnecting completely or for just for periods of time, or even just getting off certain platforms altogether. Like for me, there's certain platforms that I just don't even go on anymore at all. Just, out of protecting my own mental health.
Thanks, Amanda. So reporting, switching off, knowing the platforms and the risks, all very helpful for our mental health. Thank you for that. And sorry, Debbie, interrupted you.
Yeah, that's great advice, I think. And sometimes, when I'm talking about the stuff that I research, or it's not just that I research, I'm kind of immersed and following a lot of these debates a lot of the time online, and you kind of come up for air and you're talking about TERFs and, incels or whatever, and somebody says, what's a TERF, what's an incel, and you kind of go, thank God people don't know this. Actually, you kind of forget that it's great. There's a whole world out there where people just don't care about this stuff, or not that they don't care, but they're unaware of this toxicity and the level of toxicity. And that is a good reminder that the world you've been in for the last few hours isn't the only world. So I think Amanda's point is really, really useful. And I loved that, Mary, that you said being able to argue, because this brings us back to real basics again, and it brings us back to why we don't teach philosophy in schools, because if we did, people would be able to argue, right? And the other thing is that we found this, James and I did some research quite a long time ago now, but talking to girls about conflict and bullying offline, online. And one thing we found is that for girls, confrontation is still taboo. Having direct disagreements and arguments is still very much taboo, face to face. And this is a major problem linked to the other thing of being able to argue. All children need to be able to taught how to argue respectfully and to disagree, but also to air, grievances with one another. This seems to be really sorely lacking. So this is a problem of persistent sexism among children and how they're brought up, and in school cultures as well. So I do think that's a major issue. Because some people say never engage. That depends, again, like you say, Mary, on how comfortable you are with arguing with certain people. And, you know, a lot of online digital feminists are out there engaging and arguing on a daily basis because that's their war and they've chosen to fight that war. But I think you have to be very thick-skinned and know what you're doing and, you know, be very aware of your own kind of self-care and mental health if you're going to take on that role. So yeah, I mean, I would probably agree with never engage. But I think another really helpful thing is to, you know, to remind people about the power law that operates on most platforms, that, you know, the hate and the vitriol and the confrontation is coming from a small minority of people. In fact, the content on nearly all forums and platforms is coming from a very, very small minority of very powerful actors. And then there's a kind of secondary level of people who interact a bit, but the vast majority of people don't really contribute or aren't particularly active. So it's good to put that in perspective and to remind us that this is a very vocal, a very small group of people usually. And yeah, technology has given them a voice that they normally probably wouldn't have had. So you have to remember that as well. One thing I often do is click into their accounts and inevitably, you know, they have a string of numbers, no name, no photograph, and one follower. And, you know, I find that really useful as well, just clicking into all those accounts and just going, oh yeah, they're nobodies. It's a sock puppet account. This is just, you know, it's effectively a bot. It's actually not personal. This is in the case when it is political. You know, these things I think are psychological strategies that can be helpful, is to keep reminding yourself that a lot of this is part of the culture wars. The attacks are intensely personal because that's a psychological strategy. But actually, maybe it's helpful to think of them as not really personal. That person doesn't know you, so it can't really be personal. It's just they're trying to make it personal because they know that that's going to unnerve you. It's going to hit all your, you know, your weaknesses and your fears, and it's going to undermine your confidence. But some of those strategies I think are useful. Again, this applies more to the kind of political abuse and hate rather than to interpersonal, which is, I guess, a whole other area.
Thank you, Debbie. The kind of personal politics of engagement you very nicely described. You should get into politics yourself. So it's very, very well balanced. And indeed, even just that reflection on, because there's always a fine line between saying to someone, you know, the role of thick skin and resilience. We're always conscious, of course, of never getting to anything that would be tantamount to victim blaming, for example. But yet we know the role of engagement and confrontation as well, as you've both nicely outlined. So thank you for that. Some really, really helpful strategies, which hopefully people will take something from. We've about 11, 12 minutes left, and I'll open the floor. Maybe the panelists have questions for each other as we collate any questions from our audience in the Q&A box. So the floor is open. You may wish to raise your hand and introduce yourself, or you can use our question and answer box as well. I think Amanda is rejoining us. We have two Amandas. We can see you, don't worry.
Can you see? Yeah, sorry, my laptop was having a nightmare. Decided to start updating.
We thought you had taken Debbie's advice and had unplugged, but so do we have any questions?